All right. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jason Kretsch. I'm the head of sales here at ShuttleOps. Thank you for joining us for our November. I'm already forecasting October AMA roundtable focused on containers in your DevOps strategy. We're really excited to have everybody here. We've got a great set of panelists that are joining us today. All experts, both in their jobs and maybe in their own minds on the areas of containers. So we're going to have a really interesting conversation today. They'll introduce themselves in just a few seconds. I did want to first just remind people really quickly, for those of us that have been following ShuttleOps and sort of what we've been doing over here. Last 2 weeks ago, we actually launched our container support, which is why we actually are having this as a topic, is to emphasize one of our big announcements from this month, which rolled out on October 6th, which is support for Docker and Kubernetes deployments. You can see some of the capabilities that we've built into the product here. I'd encourage everybody on this call. I know a lot of people that joined this call last month concluded the sort of roundtable by signing up at ShuttleOps. You can do so at app.shuttleops.io. It's totally free for you to do so. We've got a really interesting and helpful integrated walkthrough of the product that helps you get started very effortlessly. And if you're using Docker or containers, you're deploying to Kubernetes, I'd really highly encourage you to go check out what we've built in terms of Kubernetes deployment. We use a phrase around ShuttleOps quite frequently called drowning in YAML. And what we've done is create a really interesting abstraction on top of Kubernetes, among other things, that helps you sort of avoid the YAML drowned risk. So please go take a look, app.shuttleops.io. You can do that today. And as I mentioned, we've got the free product tour as well, including some free AWS credentials if you want to try deploying to the cloud as well. So really quickly, one more thing before we have introductions. We are doing another roundtable before the holidays on November 18th, 2020. So for those of you that have been regular attendees, please go up and sign up for the next one. We're going to cover Kubernetes. And then also just a retrospective and look forward. 2020 has been an interesting year. 2021 is promising to be just about the same. So we'll spend a little bit of time looking back on what we learned in 2020 and sort of maybe making some forecasts or predictions for what 2020 will look like in the context of DevSecOps and all things related. So with that, I want to turn it over to our panelists. Who I'm going to ask to introduce themselves. And since I'm going to go in the order of the screen, I'm going to start with Chris, and then Chris, introduce yourself, your role, and then call on the next person you'd like to be on the chopping block.
Thanks, Jason. Hey, everyone, I'm Chris Madrigal. I'm a global solutions architect for Venafi that focuses on cloud and DevOps use cases. Just, to give a little explanation of what Venafi does is that we focus on machine identities. So basically securing the communication between different machines, rather than the general use case, which you tend to see, which is people to machines. So that might be usernames and passwords. We focus more on certificates. Peter.
Hello, everybody. Peter McKee. I'm the head of developer relations at Docker. I focus on more teaching and writing about development and containers in Docker. Yeah. How about you, Jan?
Thanks. Yeah, my name is Yonathan, and I work at ShuttleOps. I come from a Kubernetes operator background. That was kind of my first rodeo, being thrown into managing production Kubernetes clusters in the health tech field. And now I do a lot of services work. So I work with some large companies, some Fortune 500 companies, some companies in the e-commerce side, and even in the restaurant industry. And I work with multiple solutions, not just Kubernetes-based ones, but yeah, I just try and help organizations achieve their DevOps needs. What about you, James?
Hey, thanks, Jonathan. I'm James Casey. I am a program manager at Microsoft. I work inside a developer division. We do a bunch of stuff, including Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code, and all of the programming languages inside Microsoft, .NET, TypeScript, a bunch of others. The team I work on focuses on Azure and the developer experience around Azure. So how do we make it that as you come to Azure, you've got a really great experience as a developer, that it's delightful, seamless, and really good. And last up, I think, is Greg.
Hey, everyone. I'm Greg. I'm a senior DevOps specialist at ShuttleOps. Very involved with the product, and it was really involved in like the new Kubernetes features that we've added recently to the platform. You know, looking forward to talk to some of you. I hope that you guys, you know, listen to Jason, you know, log in, try the product, and you know, any feedback that you can give us is valuable. So happy to be here.
Awesome, thank you. So I want to just mention for the people joining us today, there are two features that I hope everybody is very familiar with in Zoom. One is the chat window. The other is the Q&A function. We had about 10 questions submitted in advance of the call by people who are participating in today's roundtable. So we will get those answered. That said, if you do have additional questions and or things that you want clarified during the context of the conversation, I will be monitoring both the Q&A as well as the chat, and we'll try to graciously interrupt our panelists to get your questions answered. So feel free to ask. But turning the tide to the conversation, I want to start out with, I always use a surprise question to keep all the panelists sort of on their feet. And I tell them that they're going to be a surprise question, but I don't tell them what it is. So I want to know, using less than 3 words, how would you define or describe containers? And when were you first exposed to them as part of an architectural decision and or framework?
All those questions with 3 words.
No. The define containers in 3 words. Then you can describe your history with them in a little bit more detail. You don't have to do that all in 3 words.
I would say, I would describe containers in 3 words as a running isolated process. That's fair. I was first exposed to containers or Docker probably about, before I came to Docker, obviously, so about 4 or 5 years ago. I had a custom development shop, and I forget exactly, maybe Hacker News, but I got pointed to Solomon's video really quick. And at first I had no idea what it was like. Cool, I don't get it, right? We have VMs. And then once it clicked, I was like, oh, okay, this is a game changer. And then that's when I harassed Docker to come work with him. But and there was a third question, was there?
No, that was it. That was it. All right, what about you, Chris?
3 words, I guess, describe containers: portable, reusable, and I guess new. I would like to say still new, but that'd be 4, but new. And the reason why I say that is, so my exposure to containers actually started when I got out of college. So I've only been in the industry for about 5 to 6 years. And that's when containers were still like infancy. And so, you know, I used to work in a middleware company, TIBCO, and I did a lot of work in there around containers. But the reason why I would say they're still new is because there's still a lot of development being done in that field. And it's not something where, you know, VMs, or it's not something that has been, you know, done for 20, 30 years, where you sort of have, you know, a process or, you know, exact standard to follow. There's a lot of different, you know, tools, platforms that use containers. So that's always evolving over time.
Mm-hmm. Well, James, I know you're also fresh out of college, like Chris. So why don't you answer next?
Yeah, containers in 3 words. So I would say consistently packaged applications. Okay. You know, which is really the other aspect of containers. You've got the runtime aspect, but you've also got sort of the packaging, the build time, and what you're actually exposing to the developer. When I was introduced to containers, I remember .cloud a long time ago. So 2012, 2013, before .cloud pivoted and became Docker. And I think, you know, if you think about that, it's like, if you think about the birth of containers came out of all those early passes. So folks like Heroku, folks like .cloud, where they weren't going to create containers, but they were going to create a really simple developer experience that you could run. And to me, I still think that's one of the most valuable parts of containers. You know, I think we will talk a lot in the next hour probably about complexity. And I think it's all about how do we get back to that vision that containers are to try to help us to solve. How can we easily package our applications, how we can deploy them and run them anywhere.
Great answer. And then Jan and Greg, you guys get to finish this off. Jan, you go first because you're probably more fresh out of college than Greg is. And if you can reference everything back to your college years using a drinking story, perhaps, I don't know.
Yeah, so first three things that came to my mind is namespaces, C groups, and file system. And I know that's all, you know, and that's probably not even the accurate top 3 things that you need to know about how containers are implemented. But I just remember my exposure to containers was since I'm more fresh out of college or university than most panelists here, was in my late university days when I was, instead of doing ecology, I was actually using HashiCorp Terraform during class, which is why I'm not that great of a student. But I just remember reading about, you know, how containers are implemented and being pretty fascinated by it. My first exposure to it was, you know, what I describe as my first rodeo when my first manager and mentor kind of told me that he explained to me the reasons, you know, why we're using containers. And the first thing was, you know, how we're able to actually, you know, manage our resources more efficiently when we, you know, pack, you know, several pods on Kubernetes rather than, and worry about like just horizontally how many worker nodes we have. And also just, you know, pointing to my experience with configuration management, you know, that we did for our self-managed Kubernetes clusters. And he said, well, imagine if you're doing that for the application. Imagine if all this isn't to run Kubernetes binaries, but to like make sure that the JRE is, you know, at the correct version for your developer. And that's really going back to what everybody else said, which is, you know, consistently packaged applications and just providing the right level of abstraction to developers, which is what it means to me. What about you, Greg? What does it mean to you?
So yeah, I didn't want to rehash what all you guys have been saying, all great things. I want to keep it simple and say, to me, it's just a great developer experience. My first interaction with Docker and containers was in that sort of local dev experience where you're working on like maybe a monolith app where you have dependencies that you need to run, like Postgres and Redis, maybe Kafka, Nginx, and just actually being able to use containers to do that quickly and easily was great. You know, before that we used Vagrant, and that's slow and painful. And on the computer they first give you out of college, when you start working somewhere, it doesn't always have the most resources, right? So I think just that first experience really opened my eyes to how the developer experience could be changed and made easier.
Okay, so
back to you, Jason.
Oh, well, I have a very, very specific memory of when I was first exposed to containers, and it involves Kelsey Hightower, and him giving a keynote at a conference that I was at. And I just remember kind of like not even understanding remotely what I was seeing or what I was experiencing, but being entranced by Kelsey Hightower and sitting in the office and sort of, or sitting in the audience and going, wow, this seems pretty cool. This seems pretty functional. This seems like it does a lot, and it's gonna overpromise and underdeliver. And I had no idea what Kubernetes was at that point. So I was just like, wow, this is pretty whiz bang. And ever since, I've been a fanboy of Kelsey Hightower. So that's my memory. I don't remember what year that was, but it was a while back. So Chris, you mentioned something about sort of it's not new, or it's still new, right? I actually posted on LinkedIn today. I saw an interesting thing from a DevOps group about sort of cloud adoption, the stages of cloud adoption, and so much of this gets talked about. Containers, Kubernetes, they've been hot topics for a while now, right? Everybody kind of jumped on a bandwagon. Everybody sort of, that's at least what you hear a lot is that containers are just widespread, Kubernetes widespread. My hypothesis has always been that there's a heck of a lot more people out there that aren't anywhere near touching this in an effective way, utilizing it, understanding the structural changes, Chris, I think you brought up, that need to take place in terms of your application architecture to really utilize and find power in some of this. And so, for those that are like listening to this and wondering, how do I sort of get started with containers? What things do you think people need to know as they sort of start out? What prerequisites do they need to consider? What are some things to avoid? Sort of, that's sort of my first prompt that I'd love everybody to give a little bit of thought about in terms of, how do you get started with containers and what do they need to know? And I'm not going to call it on anybody. Whoever wants to jump in first.
Well, it's Peter. I'll jump in. Outside of, some getting started YouTube videos or blog posts, right? Outside of that, just getting your head wrapped around some of the tactics and those type of things, commands and whatnot. I think one of the biggest things that I see folks come into containers, is that perspective and to your point of, we're still new, but I've been using containers a bit at Docker for 4 years. So yeah, I think everybody's using it, right? And everybody understands these are not VMs, but I find myself still explaining the difference between VMs and containers. And that was kind of to my earlier answer of, it's a process, right? It's just at the bare bones, it's a process that uses operating, OS constraints to isolate that process, right? And so if you really understand that, then you kind of set aside these older thoughts of VMs and running multiple processes. I get, asked a lot, do I run multiple processes in a container? How do I log? I'm logging to a file inside a container, various questions like that. But I think at the foundational level of understanding, it's just a process that has a file system. There's some things in that file system, but thinking when you're first starting, a process that's isolated, that's just like any other process on your system. And then you virtualize the OS. The OS is kind of virtualized, right? And it's that paradigm shift of maybe coming from, bare metal to VMs and now to containers, a viewport into thinking about containers. I think that's very helpful. And if you get that first, then some of the other stuff might be easier to understand.
Yeah. What else?
The way I think about it, I think that's like that whole point about trying to understand what the solution is really important. The other thing that I think people have to think about is, what problems are they trying to solve in what they're doing right now? So, I think Peter mentioned, we moved from bare metal to VMs. Why did we do that? We virtualized, so we got some isolation. We could do better packing onto hardware, so we could run 5 VMs on one box rather than having to put that. So, and sort of containers takes some of those things and takes it to the next level. Now I run 50 containers on a box instead of 5 VMs. It's lightweight, it's simpler. So I think it's always come back to what your problem is. If your problem is, my boss has told me I have to use containers or I have to use Kubernetes, then containers or Kubernetes may be your problem. But if your problem is, I want to have better isolation, I want to have the same workload, or I have problems going from dev to production, the assets I run in production are different than dev and problems keep coming up. If those are your problems, containers can be your solution because of those properties. So I think that's the really interesting thing, for everything that Peter said around isolation, around virtualization of the OS, what are your problems and is containers solving it for you? And I think the others only go as far as you need to, because, at a certain level, it's just complexity. You're going to move it around somewhere else and you're going to have to learn about it. Sometimes it just doesn't go away. So what is your problem you want to solve, and how far down a container path do you have to go to get a good solution for that problem?
Yeah. I love that, James, right? It's because at the end of my statement, you can say, so what? Why do I need it? Right. Yeah. 100%. 100%.
Anybody else have anything to add on that? Because I want to ask, another question, which is, so, a couple things that came up also in sort of the, describe containers in 3 words was, great developer experience. I think that was parroted, echoed like 3 times. Great developer experience is important. We want our developers happy, healthy, and, well fed, and maybe not well rested, but, certainly happy doing their job, feeling like they're contributing. So that developer experience matters. But kind of a sort of inverse question on that is like, I heard say, they're lightweight, they're simpler, but like James mentioned, like maybe your boss is like telling you have to use containers and Kubernetes. Well, what if you're a developer and you think containers and Kubernetes are the right path forward for your development organization? How do you sort of paint that picture in sort of the business value that they deliver? How would you make the inverse pitch versus, the command and control? How would you pitch the value of containers and whatnot upward? Maybe.
I was like,
yeah. Go, Jan.
I was actually thinking exactly of that question when James was talking, because there is, of course, the whole trickle down pitch for it versus sort of, the team, a team of developers, a team of operators, kind of like working in their own cadence and figuring out, the best solutions and selling it to the rest of the organization, I guess. And I think that, first of all, if you were to force a developer, I want to say a pure developer who spends most of their time in their IDE and has a tab open, on their organization's GitHub or Bitbucket or GitLab, and you're telling them, okay, now you have to containerize everything, you have to push to this repo, you do this, there's going to be a big learning curve there. And what's the actual value that they're getting out of it as a developer? And I think that the cloud native ecosystem has a lot to offer in terms of enabling developers. So, and this isn't a sort of effort that a developer can do by themselves. There has to be a good interaction between the operations team and development team. But eventually you can get to a point where the developer no longer has to worry about how they don't have to worry about a sort of like metaphorical wall of, once I actually, commit everything to the VS repository, once it all builds and runs in production, and like, I don't know what's going to happen. I think eventually you can get to the point where you're familiar with the abstracted Kubernetes manifest. Maybe you're running Minikube, locally, and you might even be using something like Scaffold. So that's sort of like, it's a tool for Minikube, so you could actually like, develop some manifests, or you could, run your containerized applications without worrying about like having a container registry. You have at the very left, moving left to right, you have your local development, and that's very similar to what you have in, staging and production, right? So you're able to break down that wall as a developer, which is valuable, and it actually has you spend a lot less time, in this sort of traditional organization where you throw things over that wall, and then you have to like wait for the DevOps team to get back to you or whatever, or the operations team to get back to you. So there's that. And when you get further down into maturity, you're actually able to make use of things like application tracing, and have monitoring tools that are standardized in the cloud native ecosystem, like Prometheus and Grafana Loki, right? For monitoring and logging respectively. You can have Jagger for application tracing. So when there's something going on in production, or when your customer success team is saying, well, this thing is really friggin' slow, what's going on? Rather than having a headache and looking at the code and getting the operations team to send the logs and kind of see what's going on, and looking, saying maybe the database there's something wrong with the database, maybe we forgot to put an index, you can actually see like all the transactions, and you have these tools enabling you. So that's the sell from the bottom up, is that there are so many tools within the container, so the cloud native ecosystem, that can actually drive your development team to work more effectively and be enabled. That's my view of it, at least.
So Jan, I think if people rewatch this recording, you just gave a reference architecture for a DevOps tool chain in your response, which was great. So record that, because he just gave you all the answers for the tools you need to use. I think though, like if I sort of play that back, you actually made the case that containers are a key part of the sort of shift left mentality of DevOps, which is getting more done in the development lifecycle earlier. Is that kind of like one way of summarizing what you said?
I think so. I think that's sort of a after effect of, breaking down the negative symptoms of, I want to say the more traditional organizations where there are, complex handoffs between teams and a lack of tooling for developers to use.
Okay, got it. Other thoughts on that particular question, which was around business value? How do you make the pitch for why a development team should sort of start adopting / utilizing containers as part of their development strategy? Any other thoughts?
So from what I've seen, or from what I've experienced personally, people don't really make changes unless there's pain involved, and that pain might be different, or it might be different types of pain. But ultimately, if you're trying to have, a change in your organization, let's say your management doesn't understand that containers are something valuable to the company. As a developer, the best thing to do is find out what's painful to them and how can, your suggestion solve that pain. And so that might be, you might have a giant fleet of VMs. Maybe there's an enormous cost because you're not using, the amount that you have. You're only using 50% of the CPU or something like that. Mm-hmm. So, from a monetary perspective, you have management basically wasting 50% of the budget on, VMs that aren't being used. And so you can make that case where, Docker containers are quickly spin up, quickly spin down. They're easy to, if you have a greater load, you can bring those up to match the load. If you have less, you bring them down. And so things like that, I think the technical aspect is fine when you're talking to technically minded people. But if you go to someone, management that isn't very technical, and you start talking about, certain things that container brings, portability and things like that, they're just going to look at you and say, well, so what? And it ultimately drives back to what do they care about, and that's what pain do they experience.
Yeah. Looking at like the success criteria for the organization and aligning it as part of your business case, I think is interesting to point out. I think that's true of all sort of technical change initiatives, which is trying to identify either what you need to amplify or what you need to diminish in some ways. So I think that's a really good point, Chris. One question that we got, and they're sort of related from two of the people attending that I want to make sure I float. And reminder for those on the call, you can ask questions live. There were two questions submitted in advance, so I want to ask them both because I think they're somewhat related. But the first one was, can I have containers without microservices? And the second one, are there any application exceptions when it comes to making them portable by containerizing them? So I'm looking at that in the same vein and sort in terms of like prerequisites and exceptions. So talk a little bit about where containers don't work and or some of the things required to make containers work. I'd love some thoughts on that.
Maybe I can talk about the first one. Can you have containers without microservices completely? One of as you talk about digital transformation, how do you lift and shift a VM workload across to the cloud? Well, the answer generally is containerize it. Just take a snapshot and move it over. So if you think about it as a way to package up a set of bits and then run it onside an orchestrator or inside some sort of infrastructure, then yes. Are you going to get all the advantage of containers? Probably not, but will it help for that problem? Yes. So yeah, The other place where we see it a lot, like I would say all the clouds have something, like we have Azure Container Instances, Google has Cloud Run. You know, these are systems that can spin up workloads really quickly, like build tasks. Build tasks are great to be containerized. You've got a standard environment you want to give out, and you want to drop a job into it. You want it to build some software, produce an artifact, drop it off somewhere, done, and then get rid of it again. So elastic scaling workloads really work well there as well, sort of things that you might have in queues that you want to burst. So I think again, it's like some of the properties of containers that we've discussed and people have mentioned already lead to other types of workloads.
Okay. Other thoughts? Not necessarily maybe on microservices, but you know, where can't I use it? Where can't I use containers?
Yeah, you know, it's hard to draw a rough line, right? Because what do we mean by use containers? Because to James' point, you can containerize a legacy application that might be stateless and writing to disk and doing logging, maybe not in the way, you know, cloud native or whatever. So I think those are some of the applications that you look at that might be a little bit harder to put into containers. You might have to, you know, understand how your application is running, and we were talking earlier before we hit the record button of scaling, you know, scaling out, right? If these are stateless applications or stateful, I'm sorry, forgive me, that could be a little bit harder, a little bit challenging. It's not, you can't do it, but I think those are some of the things to look at. And I think when you first coming to containers and building out your strategy, right? Those are some of the things you should look at, right? Like picking that POC, because you're going to learn a lot when you do that POC. And you know, it's not always, you guys might have more insight than me. I haven't done a ton of consulting, but you know, a lot of it is, a lot of companies aren't doing evergreen development, right? You know, right click new app. It just doesn't happen, right? And so you have a ton of legacy. I hate to say that because what does that mean, right? But you have a lot of applications out there that could benefit from containerization, but might not be the easiest, you know, just write a Docker file and you're fine, right? So yeah, I think a lot of stateful applications are tough. You know, those type of things that rely on, you know, complex networking, although there's ways to overcome that now. But yeah, I think stateful is probably the biggest one that I see. And that could be anything from logging to, you know, whatever in memory, you know, storing e-commerce baskets in memory, right, on one server, right? Yeah, that's probably a horrible example, but I think you get the point, right? Stateful applications are tough.
Yeah, I think the question's really more interesting about what can you containerize and why. You know, I just, as you were talking through that, I think of a couple of examples, like what's legacy. I think the running joke for what legacy is it's all the software that makes money for your business right now.
And developers
you know,
don't want
by
to
definition.
Yeah.
But I remember I was actually at CERN, the physics lab, earlier in the year talking to them. And one of the usages they have for containers inside science is how do you reproduce an experiment later on? So, you know, if you think about these large scale experiments that are running 20 years and they write it for one operating system with one compiler, and then 10 years later they go, did we really do that right or not? Hey, if you containerize it with, as Peter said at the start, the OS built into it and everything, that whole workload, you can come up 10 years later and rerun it. So there's these amazing properties that you begin to get of longevity around it. Hey, can I take this workload I wrote 5 years ago and rerun it and see what it actually does, and does it do the same thing? So like what they're doing now is for any scientific discovery where they're writing something maybe in like a Python notebook or something, they package it up as a container and that goes along with the paper. And like, that's sort of the proof. And like, that's an amazing unintended consequence of some of these things we built for essentially commerce applications that can now be applied somewhere else.
Yeah.
So, but James, basically you said that like containers are responsible for all of the discoveries of physics and the God particle.
And they're not responsible for any of the faults or any of the mistakes. Let's be
And
completely clear about that.
And the warp drive and the replicators, basically, containers will make that possible. That's my takeaway. No, that's great. For those that don't know, James used to work at CERN, so I'm assuming they invited you back because you're a brilliant emeritus of that organization. So Anything else on that particular point? We did get a live question, so I want to bubble that in here next. But any other point, Chris? Did you have something?
Yeah, I mean, to sort of flip the question a little bit though, rather than saying can, I think it should be more should, because there's a lot of different, deployment endpoints that you can use. And, to keep it simple, we can talk about VMs, containers, and functions. And so there's certain use cases where you very much would rather use something like a function, Lambda function, or, GCP Cloud Run type of deal, Microsoft as well, because, whatever you're trying to build out just serves that better. As mentioned earlier, you technically can containerize anything, but is it, in your best interest? If it's a stateful application, probably not. You probably want to leave that on your VM or bare metals installation. If you're having something where it's a one-time run and you don't need to have it running 24/7, maybe a function that only, an HTTP call is what activates it or something like that. So a lot of those things have to be, thought of when you're thinking of designing these things, because you don't want to ultimately say like, oh, containers solve everything. And then when you get to a certain point, you realize that, well, I've done too much, or maybe, I've done too little. And sort of figuring that beforehand makes a lot less pain in the future.
So you took away my idea of it solving the God particle. Then that's sad. I was very hopeful there for a second. No, I'm just kidding. That's great.
That's what Kubernetes is for.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah,
Got it.
Kubernetes
The combo. Okay, yeah, I've heard Kubernetes does everything. Yeah, it seems to. So Mark asked a question, and I'll just read this for the panel. But it sounds like a lot of the advantages are letting the developer control configuration and runtime without having to make assumptions about the production environment. But how does the DevSecOps team ensure governance, patching, and security of the runtime? Sounds like maybe developers still have some of the same obstacles when it comes to getting their containers provisioned. And interesting, before we get answers, as you comb through, say, LinkedIn, and you look at various companies that are doing, discussions like this or webinars and whatnot, containers and security seem to be like, if you were to like sort of make a word cloud, very closely related in the Venn diagram of a lot of things popping up right now. So I think containers and security, as I take the sort of gist of this question largely being about, seem to be a hot button topic. So I'd love people's thoughts on that. And Mark, thank you for the question.
So I really like this question because I immediately thought about three things, and I really want the input from some of the other panelists here. But I think immediately what happens when you are starting to deploy in containers rather than on VMs is the general perception of where the attack vector is sort of shifts, right? I think there is at least I perceive a sort of lack of attention towards container runtime security, or how people in the DevOps space, see containers as a valid attack vector. I think it definitely is. I think there are arguments to say that it is less of an attack vector because most of the containers you're running in production, or maybe even all of them, depending on the organization, are not going to be privileged containers. But I still think it's valid. Either way, it shifts because the idea of all the traditional governance in terms of doing runtime compliance, in terms of patching, I think most of that is going to be focused on the underlying hardware. So on for example, your orchestrators worker nodes, or the Kubernetes worker nodes, for example. But in containers, there are interesting things that you could do. So you could do build time compliance. So you could use something like Trivy, which it's a tool I really like, that could actually assess the CVEs on your container base image. So like, let's say you're on Alpine, and it could even detect the CVEs you have on that Alpine image, and that can eventually force you to upgrade the base image when sometimes it's ignored otherwise. Because I've seen, old Alpine versions being used. Well, Alpine, by the way, for anybody who doesn't know, is a very commonly used base image for containers in the container community, the general user base for Kubernetes, for example. So that will force you to like patch it. Or update at least. It could also detect like your, I think Trivy does this as well. I think that I might be conflating it with another tool that does this, but it could detect the, like let's say you have like a package.json, it could see like for your Node.js application, it could see, any vulnerable npm packages that you have, and that will actually enable your developers to, it'll incentivize them to, update them. And then there's also runtime compliance tools like Falco, for example. And there's also like service mesh for your, in Kubernetes, for example, that will dictate which service can talk to what. So really the landscape of governance completely shifts, in my opinion, when you go to containers. And in a lot of cases, developers don't even have to worry about it. Perhaps a developer team lead that might have to, work with the operations team and dictate, well, which services I need to communicate with when they do the service mesh. All of these are very like highly mature sort of things for organizations. But I want to hear other people's thoughts on the topic of cloud governance and how it relates to containers.
Well, I'm definitely not an expert in the governance or security. And I will never claim that. I don't want to put a big bullet, what do you call it, target on my back being a Docker. But yeah, it's interesting on how, culture, I think, plays into it a little bit, meaning way teams are structured. If you have, I've seen, it's Jason, you mentioned, I just did a security workshop last week with Sneak, right?
Yep.
So we were talking about that, of course, but in that workshop, we talked a little bit about two types of scenarios, where the one where you have the full development team, you don't really have a DevOps or an ops team, or if you do, they're small, and and the development team owns that whole image and has to make sure that reduce the vulnerabilities as much as possible, right? But then another scenario that I like is having a separate team that manages your base images that all of your development teams then use, right? And you shift that a little bit more into the whatever, if that's a DevOps or DevSecOps or something, right? And that maintains that, you have, I hate to say gold, gold image, right? Because it harkens back to the VM days, right? But still, here's your node, 12, whatever, 14, whatever, that you should be using, and then putting governance in place and scanning to make sure that we don't use any other base images. I think that helps. I think that's one way to kind of attack it. Yeah.
I think that base image conversation is really important. I think, again, it comes back to some of the fundamental features of the way containers are built, with layers and with a lot of the metadata baked in. One of the nice things you get is you can actually go to a container that's running and ask it questions. So, what is that base layer? And what is the SHA? What is the hash of it? And is that in the list of ones that I think are trusted? So again, like one of that was really hard to do on a VM. How do I trust everything outside my app? I could ask what version of a jar file, or even if I'm a Node app, what version is packaged in there, and what dependencies. But now you can really say for any bit in that container where it is. Yeah. I think, again, security is one of those things that, as I've talked to customers, the good thing is there's always a market for more security tools, because everybody uses more and more and more of them to find different aspects of this. Yeah, what containers gives you is this sort of artifact in the middle, and you've got pre-artifact and post-artifact. You need security on both sides. You need your, I think, Mark, your question's really around how do you govern that runtime? Well, what bits are going into the runtime? And then how do you package those up? And you're going to have to do the exact same sort of secure lifecycle development lifecycle process as you've always done. As Yonathan says, the tools might be different, but the process is the same. But now you've got this artifact that you sort of know everything that went into it. So when you're running it, you can now at least know where it came from, what bits it came from, and what to do with it. So I think some of the obstacles are there. You still need to structure the teams. You need to structure how these sources of layers come together, and who's responsible for which one, and making sure that things don't sneak in you don't want, et cetera, et cetera. Same problems as always, but at least you have the metadata. At least you can ask questions.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's important too, to think about your SHA, not just the tag, right? Not even, I know I talk a lot about the latest, don't use latest, right? But even if you point to a tag, that they're not immutable, right? So they can change underneath you. So you think you have, something's fixed and pushed, and you build again, and you could accidentally introduce something by using just the tag, right? So SHAs are very important.
Greg, I think you had something you were going to say. I saw you start speaking, and since Jan decided to call on everybody, Chris, you're next, so prep your thoughts. But Greg, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think James pretty much covered it, but like, I think, I did a service stint with PagerDuty, and what they did that was really great there was like built that into the CI process as early as possible. So that like the developer experience, sure it changes when they have like security standards that they have to meet, right? But it doesn't have to be that painful. Like if you can actually build it into your CI and give that feedback as soon as possible. As a developer, like it's much easier to stay on top of that. And also scan before you deploy, right? Just like Peter alluded, right? Like if you're deploying tag dev, the shot could be totally different at two different points of time. So, there's also tools out there like I think like Graphus is like this container metadata tracking tool where you can track, the output of scans and what is allowed to be deployed, and then you can actually use another tool that integrates with it. I think it's called like Christus or something, and actually make sure you're deploying an image that meets your criteria.
Chris.
I think everything I wanted to say was mostly said by everyone else, but I guess added my 2 cents would be, I think the base image conversation is something that's just really big to have, and just to understand that, a private repository for your base images is something that, you want to work, the developers want to work with their DevSecOps team to, have up. And, maybe the DevSecOps teams owns that private repository, make sure that they have the most up-to-date base image versions and things like that. And that will be paired with something like an artifactory for the different artifacts that you're, the images that you're building end up using. That helps very much on the security point of view, because if, Docker Hub is very nice, public repositories are very nice when you're, testing things, but, there's no way for you to really know unless, because you don't have control of certain things other people are publishing. You're leveraging what other people are publishing. So from a more enterprise use case, making sure that there's that relationship in the enterprise for then that private repository and those artifacts and things like that just goes a long way. And then you tie that with scanning, and that, helps out a lot.
On that note, has anybody noticed that when you push, when you push an image to a public repository, well, to Docker Hub, you get a ridiculous number of pulls, like millions. Like I remember, and I think Greg, you would tell me the exact same thing, that you had a Docker image on Docker Hub that you just used for testing, and it had like 10 million pulls or something like that. So I think there are, in the same way that, like, let's say you have a EC2 instance or an Azure VM instance, and you expose port 2020, you can see a lot. And if you were to like look at the access logs, like you could see that you're getting authentication attempts from like all over the globe. I think there's stuff like that for containers as well, right? Although with if it's going to be a private image, it's going to be a way different story. But I just thought that that's kind of an interesting thing that happens in containers. So there is a shift from, traditional sort of probing that happens with virtual machines. Well, you get something similar, I guess, with public containers, where I think they pull them and they try and dissect them and see if there's any sort of secrets or anything that were baked into the container.
Some sort of vulnerability. Okay. Okay. So in the context of that, we talked a little bit about, and one of the things that we discussed as a panel were sort of, and this is probably going to be one of our lastest questions, because we're coming up to the top of the hour, but there was a few mentions of things that could be pulled into your CI processes in the context of security. Greg, I think you kind of formulated that. What other things for people that are running, sort of a regimented CI/CD process today to do their application development and deployment? What sort of other things need to be comprehended in the context of, their CI/CD or app dev processes when it comes to utilizing containers? What are some of the things to be mindful of, and or consider, and or think about reforming from a process perspective?
I think one of the things to remember is containers isn't the only part of your application. So if you might have a Docker Compose file, you might have Helm charts if you're going to Kubernetes, you have all this configuration and metadata as well. And you need to treat that as exactly the same in version, just like your containers. I think the good thing is like a lot of the registries now support things like OCI artifacts, where you can just treat something like a Helm chart, like an artifact in the registry alongside your containers. You need to think about versioning that whole bundle together and moving it forward. I think I was just thinking that in the context of security one as well. You know, like, yes, you're deploying these container workloads, but what are we deploying them into? And there's a lot of configuration around the outside as well. So thinking about how do you move to, you know, a full sort of GitOps style where you have one repository that talks about your code and your infrastructure definition, and then one process to build all your artifacts out of that, and then a process to then do CD out of that. Always think about the full scope.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'm not sure if you include in that, James, you know, secrets management, right?
Yeah.
Super
exactly.
important. Yeah.
Any other sort of thoughts on that? I have. Go ahead, Chris.
Oh, yeah. So, and this might also go back to the whole security question, but just the idea that containers, you know, for the most part, tend to be built and torn down pretty often. You know, unlike VMs, you know, you're not going to really have containers that are running for years or even months. You know, for in the most part, you know, you might have them for a few days, maybe a week, and they'll get replaced by a similar, you know, container. And so, you know, from a security point of view, because you're consistently rebuilding, you have the chance to update those containers, you know, often. But then from like a CI/CD point of view, DevOps point of view, you need to make sure that your process is, you know, built in a way that it supports that deployment model. You know, if you have processes that are manual, if they're manual checks, and that becomes a pain to deal with if every week you have to do, or every day you have to do a change, or there's a build, because now that's emails you have to go through, you have to go get approvals and things like that. So just keeping that in mind, you know, what tools actually allow you to, you know, go from point A to point B consistently, you know, reliably every day. That's just, you know, should be the overall thoughts when you're thinking of what tools to use.
Yeah, the assembly line becomes even more important in the context of this because you're doing it so much more frequently. That's a great point. Jan, Greg, anything to add? And then I have two questions that came from the audience directly to me, so I want to ask these so that I don't ignore people's questions, and they're sort of orthogonal somewhat, so they're not going to fit into the flow of this, but I'm going to ask them anyway.
Yeah, I think I talked enough, but I just want to plus one the idea of assessing your CI pipelines and remembering that it's not just containers, it's also your Kubernetes manifest or your Helm charts, and really thinking about how you want to handle one path to production, starting with those CI pipelines.
Okay. Greg, you're shaking your head, so I'm assuming that means
yeah, it's a great. These guys got it handled. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so two final questions, and then we'll conclude the hour. But these came in from sort of people on the call, so I want to ask them. But in the context of sort of when you have an application dependent on a database, would you containerize those together or containerize them separately?
Separate.
I think the question.
Go ahead, Greg, please.
Yeah, the question I think was really about like handling updates, right? Like, how do I do that in a proper way? And to me, like, that's something that is not in scope of really what containers solve. And what you should look at is your framework that you're using, right? Like, if you're using Rails, they have migrations through Rake. Like, if you're talking about strictly web apps and migrations and updating your schema, like, try and find some way through your framework to do that properly.
Okay.
Yeah. Or just use Mongo and throw everything in.
Okay. Create a dumping ground. Got it. Okay, and then here's one which comes back to maybe I don't guess security, but in the sense of multi-cloud, the question was, how can I digitally safely transfer my container between multiple cloud providers?
I think we answered that one. Run your own registry. You know, I think that is the key for so many things. Think about these artifacts. Would you put your source code on public repositories externally? If the answer is no, then don't put your containers there. You have to treat this as another artifact in your pipeline. Every cloud offers great registry offerings. There are great open source offerings like Harbor as well, from CNCF, VMware. This is just should be part of your tool chain now. And again, that comes down to, it gives you this inflection point. You have all your build artifacts coming to your registry that you can control, and now you can control where you want those to go out to. So everything builds around the registry.
Everybody's satisfied with James' answer. It was very emphatic. So I'm assuming we covered that base.
I'm a little hurt by James's comments, especially since we have Docker Hub.
I'm so sorry. I used to run the Azure Container Registry team, so maybe I've got opinions. Yeah, private repositories of Docker Hub are good, but it is an interesting thing. Like, think about
100%. I'm totally kidding, right? And do the right thing that works for you, right? It is a risk anytime you put anything outside of your organization. 100%.
Yep. All right. Well, we're at almost the top of the hour. I like to give people sort of like a final thoughts sort of moment at the end of the day. This has to be your most profound moment of the hour, so pressure's on. And I'm not going to call on Chris first. He got to go first last time, so I'm going to call on Greg first, since he went last time and had to hear everybody else first. So final thoughts, containers, how to be successful, anything you want, but final thoughts.
Yeah, I think like the key to being successful in moving there is just starting small and start as far left as possible. Like, don't go deploy a Kubernetes cluster and immediately start deploying production services there. Like, I would try actually from the other way. And maybe people here will disagree with me, and that's fine, but that's how I did it, and really gave myself an understanding of how to run my app locally. And like Jan said, there are tools that help you run Kubernetes locally. You don't have to use Kubernetes, by the way. There's also other solutions like Swarm and Nomad that are a lot simpler to digest for new users. So you don't have to look at Kubernetes deployment manifests and the operational overhead of managing a cluster and get nervous and kind of step back. There are other things you can use, right? So yeah, I'd start small, start in local dev, get used to things before you decide you need a Kubernetes cluster. Would be nice.
Great. And Greg, we're working with a client right now who's doing almost exactly that, which is, I think, a great point. So
yeah, they started with Compose, right, on VMs, and that's a totally fine way to start for sure.
Yeah. Jan, over to you.
Yeah, I think, like Greg said, start small. I think pay attention to the ecosystem, to the best practices, but also don't leave some of the big questions as afterthoughts. And I think a good example of them was actually the database migration question. You're going to find people who tell you to do that in your CI/CD pipelines, or people to schedule Kubernetes jobs, or those are questions without simple, easy answers. Same thing with secrets management. So maybe work with the appropriate people in your organization and figure out these hard problems. Maybe not right away, right? Start as left as possible. But really listen to the best practices, do a lot of research, and work with the people in your organization to make this effective, and not just we're doing containers just because everybody else is.
Cool, thanks, Jan. James.
Look at your own problems and try to solve them. Hopefully we've given you some of the ideas around the properties of containers that might be useful. And I think, the job to take home is say, hey, what problems am I having right now, and how can some of these things be solved by using containers? And to Greg's point as well, go as far as you have to go. Running 3 Windows VMs using Compose is a perfectly great example. That works. If that works, don't go any further. Just get it working, get it into production, and keep going.
Cool. Peter.
Yeah, I would agree with everybody and say that this is hard, right? Deploying to production in a CI/CD pipeline multiple times a day with blue-green deployments and canaries and blah 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 blah. Right? That stuff is hard. Very, very hard. I would, and the internet's is a little bit of an echo chamber, right? So you're going to read blog posts about that and see videos and Twitter, right? And it's all about these, the Netflix and chaos and blah, 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 like all this stuff, right? Just breathe. And back to the earlier points, and James got like, what do we need to solve? And is this helping us? There's a tendency, I think, as engineers, and I'm definitely, I can raise my hand very high on this, right? Sometimes we code and architect for our resume and not for what we should be actually doing, right? And sometimes, like, take a step back and first give yourself, room to say this is going to be hard, and you need a bunch of stuff to figure out first, right? And that's okay, right? Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Peter. Chris, finally for you.
So I agree with everyone or what's already been said. I guess what I would say is that containers in itself aren't a, just blanket solution. So it's not like you can just say, oh, I'll use containers as, that's my answer, like my solution to solve any problem, because it's not. There's so many other things that you need to think about and that you can use in tools, functions, VM, all around that are better than that. And then also, that was mentioned, that Peter mentioned about the whole Netflix thing. I know they have a great blog out there that a lot of people read. And, a lot of companies might look at that and say, we need to do what Netflix does. And that's not feasible because you're not a 400, 500, billion-dollar company with basically unlimited funds in engineering. You might be a small size company or a mid-sized company that needs to do this work. So there's always, certain things that best practices you can follow. But, there isn't a one size fits all where you go in and you say, this is what, container usage is, this is what DevOps usage is. Ultimately, what solves your problem is what's going to be the best solution.
Yep. Just like DevOps, containers are not a one size fits all. And on that note, I want to thank everybody who attended today's session. I want to thank our panelists. Really appreciate your time. We will publish a recording of this video and invite everybody to register for next month's AMA as well on November 18th. With that, I hope everybody has a great rest of their Wednesday. Thanks again to the panelists. Have a great day. Bye-bye.